All right, so it is written, so shall it be. That's what we've been studying for this 13 weeks. I've got a couple of more lessons. We're going to jump, after tonight, we're going to jump from the Old Testament into the New Testament with some prophecies regarding Christ. And I have one person that's going to fill in for me one of those last 3 weeks here. We're going to talk tonight about Moab and Ammon. And they were cousins to Israel. So when the growing nation of Israel edged northward out of the wilderness, after being held captive for over 400 years, in the second millennium of BC, opponents quickly barred their way. The Moabites and Ammonites were two nations that did that. In fact, these two nations hounded Israel for the next several hundred years. Eventually, they were crushed first by the Babylonians, but they survived that, and then later by the Roman army in AD 70. The two nations were known as the Ammonites and the Moabites. These two nations were also directly linked to the nation of Israel. We would say cousins to them, through Lot. So I'm going to tell you that story real quick, but first I want to make sure we have the answer up there. Both Moab and Ben-Ammin, the Ammonites, were sons of Lot, who was the nephew of Abraham. So we're going to go through this story real quick, because you have to understand the story of where these two came from in order to understand what we're talking about here. The Bible tells us the story really in Genesis chapter 18 when we start talking about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, just today, I'm listening to something online, and I'm looking, trying to get some information about it. And in there, that preacher, not a Church of Christ preacher, but that individual talks a little bit about why Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. And in their mind, they're convinced that it had nothing to do with homosexuality, but it did have something to do with that. In fact, that was high on the agenda, not the only reason, but certainly a reason that God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. And so, but it wasn't just Sodom and Gomorrah. And sometimes we forget that. There were other cities, there were 5 cities that were slated to be destroyed the same time that Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. And just to warn Bill, it's going to be a while before I get back to this, the answer sheet. Sodom and Gomorrah were just 2 of the cities out of 5 that were slated to be destroyed. The other cities were Admah, Zebulun, Zoar, Sodom, and Gomorrah. All of those cities were cities within the plain of Jordan. Exactly today where you'll find in that plain, you'll find Moab and Ammon. You would if they were still in existence, find those places. It's in Jordan, Transjordan, what we would call it today. Very key to this, because what's going to happen is God's going to say that He's going to destroy these 5 cities. In the course of all of those events taking place, we're told specifically about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. We're not really told much about the other 3 cities, except for a plea was made. And Lot is the one that makes the plea. In essence, he says, I'll have no place to go. And he prays that God might spare that little city, Zoar. And God listens to the prayer, and He does. He spares it. So only 4 of those 5 cities are destroyed. But Ammon is destroyed. Zebulun is destroyed. Sodom and Gomorrah are all 4 destroyed that day. When Lot leaves Sodom and Gomorrah And he heads out. He's going to Zoar. But do you remember where God told him to go? Mountains? To the caves, all right, to the mountains. And he goes to Zoar. And then he's not there too long, and next time you read about him, he's in the mountains. I'm not for sure why he went there first. Maybe it was just a resting place, and maybe it was planned. Maybe we're not given all that information. But he ends up in the mountains where God told him to go, but it takes a little bit for him to get there. It's kind of like, to me, I equate that to when Abraham left and went on his journey of faith. He didn't go straight to Hebron. He ended up going up to Laban's place and then over a little bit after that. But anyway, they're going to end up in the right place, but they're going to go to this little town first. And evidently, because of the destruction of those other cities, it almost looks like when you're reading the text, Zoar is completely uninhabited at that time. People have left. Well, there might be a good reason for that. If you're seeing the destruction take place on these other cities, if you're seeing the smoke and all of that rising up and the ashes from that, you might take off also. So they almost could have stayed in Zoar, but that's not what God said to do. And Lot was a righteous man, and eventually he's going to get it. It may take him a little bit longer, but he's going to understand it. Some people speculate, did they think they were the only people left on the earth? And that's a possibility from looking at the text. That it was just these three that were left. They don't know of the destruction of all these other places that's taken place. They just know they were told to get out of Sodom and Gomorrah. So they've left, and possibly that's a reason for what's about to happen. I'm not trying to justify it. I'm just saying that may have been playing in their mind. But I got to be careful, because this is not a G or a PG story in the Bible. I wrote just a few weeks ago in the bulletin, when I'm talking to those that are below 7th grade, and you come across a story that you think, oh, Mom and Dad may be mad if I tell it exactly word for word the way it is in the Bible, you kind of figure ways to say certain things instead of just saying it the way we might say it today. Like a person might be defiled, and that's how you say it, instead of other ways. Now, you'll have one of those kids in there that's going to raise their hand and say, well, what's that mean? So but you got to be careful when you're talking to these younger people. When they get to the 7th and up, I'm a little bit more relaxed to say things to where they can better understand it. But especially when they get up to 12th and whatever, we just read it, and that's the way that it is. But you kind of have to be careful. So I'm going to be careful, but it's a delicate story, and we do have one in here. All right, so the story goes this way. The two daughters and Lot, Mom's already been turned to a pillar of salt. So the two go up into the caves. So while they're in the cave that night, one of the daughters, both the daughters, come up with a plan, and Lot is made to drink, and he's drunk. And 9 months from now, a baby's going to be born. And the next night, the same thing happens again with the other daughter, and 9 months later, a baby's going to be born. And the name of that first baby is going to be Moab, I think, and the name of the second one is Ben-Ammin, or Ammon, we would say. And so those two children are going to be born. Now, but you got to remember Lot, that number one there. You got to remember him. This is Abraham's nephew. And he's a righteous man in the sight of God. Doesn't always do things exactly right, but he asks for forgiveness. He vexed us so day by day, and he tries to do the best that he can. So this happens, and that's what happens, and he has two sons, Moab and Ben-Ammin, born to him. those two children are going to become a thorn in the flesh to the descendants of Abraham. Eventually be called the Israelites. The Israelites, the Moabites, and the Ammonites are not going to get along. The Moabites and the Ammonites are going to get along fine, but the Israelites are not going to be accepted in that group with those other ones. And it's those very people, when Israel comes out of captivity, after 400 years of being in captivity, and when they eventually get up to go into the land promised to them, it's going to be the Moabites who say, you cannot cross this land. And that's where Balaam comes into play that we talked about today in class. He comes into play because he's a prophet of God, and he should have just said it a certain way, but treasures and things could have come his way if God would have simply blessed the Moabite people also, and that wasn't going to happen. Israel did the courtesy thing and went around Moab, but that could have been bad for the Moabites at that time. Most of the conflicts between the Moabites and Ammonites and the Israelites is going to be, number two, over land disputes. The very thing that we have issue with today. I lived in Cape Girardeau, Missouri for a time, way back. And across the river during the New Madrid earthquake, I wasn't alive at that time, but during the New Madrid earthquake, the Mississippi River ran backwards. And also, there was a split in the land on the Illinois side, really, and the river channeled around. So now who owns this big chunk of land out in the middle of the Mississippi? Well, Missouri's motto is show me state, so they were wanting Illinois to show why they should own it. They thought they owned it. Missourians thought they owned it, and people from Illinois thought they owned it. And so there was some friction for a while because of that land. No wars, but almost every conflict in Bible times seems to be over something like that, usually a land dispute. So that's kind of where we're at in the story. Several times throughout the history of Israel, the descendants of Ammon and the descendants of Moab joined forces against Israel. And sometimes they were successful. That's when Israel had wandered away from God. And sometimes they were unsuccessful, when Israel kept close to God and God delivered victories to them. Ammon and Moab claimed the eastern bank of the Jordan River. Now remember what we're talking about here, because today there's still conflict and it's over land. Who technically owns the western bank in Israel today? Israel. Yeah. Who thinks they own it? Yeah. Jordan, the Palestinian faction in Jordan. They think that they own it. Well, technically they did, till they made the mistake of attacking Israel. And Israel, when they retaliated from that attack, went over and took that chunk of land. And to the victors go to spoil. So if you lesson to be learned from the Jordanians, don't attack Israel. And you can keep the land you have. But if you attack Israel, they're probably outnumbered 40-1, and they did what they did. They're probably going to be successful when they retaliate. Ammon and Moab claimed the eastern bank of the Jordan River from the Dead Sea northward to it's Jabbok, but it's pronounced Yabok River as their own. Yet they lacked the strength to back up their claim. When Israel returned from Egypt back to this land that had been promised to them, Joshua found an area inhabited by another group known as the Amorites. Not the Ammonites, but the Amorites. Numbers 21:13 tells us. And Israel defeated the Amorites and began to settle the land. At this point, Ammon tried to reinstate the claim of that land. That claim became an irritation to Israel for the rest of the time that they were a nation. Without the western land contested by Israel, Ammon became relatively large and populous. The capital of Ammon, number 3, of the Ammonites, was known in Old Testament times as Rabbah, Rabbah. That's the capital of Ammon. But it's also called Rebath in Scriptures. And it runs alongside this river. And that city, number 4, is considered to be a city of water. There's springs all over that. So when I was telling the story of Lot a minute ago, living in Sodom and Gomorrah, and I think just a few weeks ago I made mention of this, but I have to do it again to understand this context here that we're talking about. When Lot stood up there with Abraham up on that area and looked down and saw the plain of Jordan, if we were to stand in that exact spot and look down today, we wouldn't see much that we would be overwhelmed and in a hurry to get to. There might be some pockets of beauty down through there, but it looks a lot different today than it did back at that time. And it probably has something to do with the destruction that God sent to Sodom and Gomorrah. But when Lot looked at that time, the Bible says it was compared to the Nile region. It had water, it had vegetation, easily for man and for his animals, livestock. And it was a place to make a good living. And so he looked and saw that, and he wanted to go in that direction. And I compared it a few weeks ago to the Garden of Eden and Eve, looking at the fruit and seeing that it was pleasing to her eye, that it would taste good and make her wise. Lust of the eye, lust of the flesh, and pride of life. And I think the same thing happened to Lot when he looked, because he had an opportunity to pray to God and say, God, what would you have me do? But he didn't do that. He saw it and he fell in love with it from that visual that Abraham allowed him to have and choose first, and he decided to go in that direction. But I stand here today telling you I would have done the same thing, I'm almost positive. When I should probably pray to God and ask Him, not should, I absolutely should, pray to God and ask Him to help me make a decision. A lot of times we don't do that. We base it on what we see or what we've heard about it, and we want to go in that direction. And it's going to cost Lot a whole lot. His life's not going to be the same because of that decision that he made. But if you stood up there and looked down there, you would see a beautiful place back then, and you would want to go in that direction also. Today we kind of scratch our head and we try to figure out why there's so much fighting over that land, because it doesn't look all that appealing in a lot of ways. But back then this city was known as the city of water because of all the springs that were around it. So it must have been something to really behold and look at. In later years, Ptolemy Philadelphus, and I'm glad that's going to be spelled up there because that would be a little tough. He named the city after him. This was now during the Greek and Roman occupation of the land. And so this man comes along, he names the city Philadelphia, which is, Emily knows it, I've seen her start to say it, city of love, brotherly love. Well, I won't say too much about our Philadelphia. But I've watched a few ball games, and I don't think it probably meets that criteria. But he changed the name to that. And it grew to be one of the most celebrated Roman cities of that region. It had rich soil and fertile agricultural settings, earned it widespread notoriety in the ancient world. In 2 Chronicles 27:5, we find that Ammon yielded an abundance of corn and other products. So all of this is written in the Scripture to help us better understand what that land was like back at that time. So here's some predictions regarding Ammon. Prophecies directed at this biblical nation by more than one prophet, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Isaiah, and others, basically says these four things about Ammon. Foreigners will come from the east and will possess the land. That was the Babylonians. All right? They came, and for a while they possessed the land. Ezekiel 25, verse 4. Rabbah, the capital, will be destroyed. Jeremiah 49:2 tells us that. But that did happen during the Babylonian occupation. But it was rebuilt. But during the Roman occupation, it was destroyed once again. Now notice the Bible doesn't say which one of those it's talking about. But there's two examples there of the city being destroyed. By the way, the people there were Ammonites. And today that capital of Jordan is Ammon, with an A instead of the O at the end there. All right. So Rabbah will become pasture for camels and a place for sheep to rest. Ezekiel 25:5. And Ammon will cease to be a nation and a people. Ezekiel 25, verse 7. So the foreigners from the east came and possessed the land of the Ammonites. And whether it's talking about just the Babylonians there or also later, it can't be Rome because they were from the west. But the Babylonians did come and do that. It's also important to realize that today it's occupied by Muslims who came from Saudi Arabia, which would have been to the east also. There's no doubt that these foreigners from the east refers to the two groups I just mentioned. Under the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, he plundered Ammon. The irony of this is that the Ammonites actually had helped the Babylonians to defeat Israel. But they were so gleeful about it, just like the people we studied about last week. They were so gleeful about it that it made Nebuchadnezzar sick to his stomach that he had dealt with these people in that way. So he plundered Ammon. When you're the king and that powerful, it's good to be the king. You could do that. He quickly regained, the Babylonians quickly gained control of the land. Eventually the cities, the houses and all of that are going to be rebuilt and flourish for several hundred years. And then they're going to be dealt a crushing blow by the Romans who occupied that land. But once again they regained the land and flourished. And then in the 7th century A.D., the Muslim invasion dealt them a fatal blow, of which they never recovered. It was not until the early 1900s that a land ruler from the east set up a palace in Rabbah, and now named Ammon, and built that palace. His name was Abdullah, and he was the ruler of Transjordan and his descendants. From that time, even, you remember the name King Hussein from Jordan? He was a descendant of this man. So the inhabitants of this area are Bedouins, Arabs, and Palestinians. The land is occupied today in that area outside of the city by herdsmen and shepherds with their flocks. You can still see pictures today of modern day cars having to stop on roads as sheep are led across the highways. Many of the cities that were back at that time were in ruins today, and they dot the landscape. And this isn't to suggest that there's no modern cities. We know in Jordan they have modern cities. But it's far different than its glory days back during the time of Ammon. Predictions regarding Moab, the brothers to Ben-Ammin. Moab was east of the southern tip of the Dead Sea. The boundary stretched no more than 40 miles. Like Ammon, Moab often did battle in Israel over land disputes. And we need to remember that it was King Balak, the Moabite, who tried to bribe Balaam to pronounce a curse against Israel. That's number 7. The prediction against Moab were as follows. Moab's cities would be laid to waste. Jeremiah 48:9. Moab's production of wine would cease. Isaiah 16:10. And that was a commodity that they had that they sold all over the place. Flocks rather than people would live in the ruined cities. Jeremiah 17:2. Moab will be destroyed as a nation because she defiled the Lord. Jeremiah 48:42. Here's the way two prominent historians see the fulfillment of these prophecies. Number 1, all of the known cities of Moab, 50 in all, have been documented to have been destroyed. Secondly, the decline of the wineries has also been fulfilled. If you visit this area today, there's no evidence of ancient wineries existing. 3, what you will see if you visit this area today are flocks of sheep and shepherds, Bedouins, to be exact. And 4, they are a people with no identity. Their voice has become completely silent in our history books. So ends the story of Ammon, and so ends the story of Moab. Through sin, they entered the world, and because of their hatred toward their cousins of Israel, they departed the world, lost in time, never to return. Egypt is where a few of them, fled after the destruction. Most of them were killed, or most of them were rounded up and scattered out as slaves throughout the Roman Empire back at that time. It's kind of sad, isn't it? To look at, even though those children may have come into the world not under the best circumstance, they had an opportunity to do what was right. And maybe Moab and Ammon may have done that. But their descendants decided to walk a different way, completely contrary to what God would have them. Wouldn't it have been great for the Hebrew people to have been able to have talked to Balak, the king, and the king would have agreed that they could walk right across the land. But that's not what happened. So they constantly were doing battles with each other because of all of this. Now there's some lessons to learn from the Moabites and the Ammonites. They had the opportunity to serve God too. They certainly were introduced to the God of the Hebrew people through Lot. So Moab and Ammon, Ben-Ammin, they knew who God was. They knew the Hebrew God. And they could have served that God. But they decided that they weren't going to listen, nor were they going to obey the voice of God. In doing that, they were not paying proper respect to God. Instead, they set up their own idols that they wanted to worship, which was, in essence, an attempt anyway to slap God in the face. And when they had the opportunity to protect the name of God, they refused to do that. So when I'm looking at things in the Bible, I often, and I think you probably do too, we try to compare those things that happened back then. Well, how's it going for us today? And I'm scared. I'm scared when I look at the United States that I have had in the past so much respect for. Yeah, there'd be some fragments of over here and over here and over here of people that I totally disagreed with. But the level to which we've gotten to today, to me, is a scary thing. Because what I think, it's doing exactly what these people did back then. It's an attempt to slap God in the face. It's never going to happen, but it's an attempt to do that. We're not paying God the proper respect that we need to be paying Him in our society today. In essence, we're not protecting our King the way that we should. Because I just talked just a little bit ago about friends of Jesus. And those apostles, when you start, if tradition has it right, when you start looking at how they died, that was horrific, the way they died. You know, we can hope that maybe we go to sleep one night and simply don't wake up in the morning. These people put their lives on the line because of the love that they had for God. So where are we today in that? And it seems like it's all flipped upside down to me. And I'm going to tell you, it's come pretty quick. Again, I know there's always been pockets of people. And I know people have always said, for generation after generation, I don't know if it can get much worse than it is today. I know that's happened. But I'm really telling you, I don't know if it can get a whole lot worse than it is today. And it scares me. But it scares me for this reason. It scares me because there's so many, we could do so much good. And we have in the past. We can do so much good in this country if we could somehow convict people to turn back to God. Now, we can still do a lot of good, can't we? We should never stop doing that. But how much more could we do if we could turn people to thinking once again the way maybe we thought at one time? And I'll say it for a third time now. Not that there wasn't pockets of resistance all of those times. So I stood in front of my class in about 1987. And I said to them, this country is going to be so much different in 100 years from now. I missed it. I missed it by 70 or 80 years. What I was talking about back then, it's already far beyond that. Some things happen today, I think, I never thought that would happen in my lifetime. And I was tacking on 70 more years to that out of, I guess, optimism. Although it was very pessimistic what I was saying, now it looks like it was almost optimistic what I was saying. So it's a little bit scary. We certainly can learn if we're willing to do that. Now I know I'm talking to the choir in here, but when I say we, I'm talking about outside these walls. We could learn a great lesson from Moab and Ammon, if we would. They wanted to do it by themselves. I've heard that so many times. Not to quote anybody in my family, but I can do that by myself. People have said that. I don't need your help. I can do that on my own. They didn't bring other people on board. They didn't even want to share their philosophy. They just wanted it to be their group. And boy, there's a danger there too. We can't get that way as the church. We can't say we're content with the way it is. Now, I know Paul talks about being content, but don't take that out of context, all right? The context is in your with your riches and things that come your way, you can be content. You don't have to keep wanting to go up and up and up. You can be content. But he's not talking about in evangelism to be content. So I had to say it that way because I considered him a friend even though he was much older than me. In a Bible class one day, I was saying, if we were to do this evangelistically, maybe we might grow some. And maybe if we did that, we might grow some more. I can't remember the things I was saying. But he raised his hand and I called on him, and his response to that was, you need to be content. And it caught me so much off guard, it really doubled me up almost. Because what he was saying was, just be content with the number you have. Why are you trying to get more? The church would die in a generation if we weren't trying to get more people to come to understand the gospel. That's the plea that's made in the New Testament. Just before Jesus ascended, in all 4 Gospels, in one form or another, mine I like the best is John. He just says, as my Father has sent me, so now I send you. How did he send him? Seek and save the lost. Now I'm sending you out to seek and save the lost. Really doesn't get much plainer than that. That's our responsibility as Christians. Yeah, it's important that we show up. It's important that we study. But all of that is really for another reason. And I'm going to say this, but let me at least give me a minute to explain it. It's not for benevolence. But benevolence is a part of it. We need to be benevolent people. But through that benevolence, we need to be edifying the members and evangelizing the lost. The Bible tells us it's not good enough to give people food and say, go and be filled. But what we need to be doing also is giving them living bread, and eternal water, so that they'll never thirst or be hungry again. Evangelism's the main part that God wants us to come to do as our job as Christians. Benevolence is in there, but it's a part of it. Edification, the building up of the saints, that's in there to keep us in a saved condition. But guess what? All of that is supposed to lead us to leave here being edified and to go out there to help tell people what we learned in here. To be evangelistic. So edification is extremely important to the members. But it's to motivate us to take the gospel out there in order to... We don't need to be in a position to where it's all about us and those out there, well, maybe they'll figure out a way. Because we want those out there to also hear, enter in thou good and faithful servant. And that should motivate us. So benevolence is important, edification is important. All those things that we read about, they're important, but they all lead to one thing. And that's to evangelizing the lost. So they'll have an opportunity to hear. And I've got a minute and a half. Face your foes with respect, not contempt. Don't relish or revel in the beat down mentality of someone else, spiritually speaking. We should realize that there are some on the other side who don't even agree with the side that they happen to be on. But due to circumstances, that's the side that they're on. And so to come in and completely wipe out or verbally wipe out a group of people just because you have the knowledge and they don't, there's a thought in there of love that we're going to try not to beat a person down, but to show them the love that we have for their soul so that they can become a New Testament Christian too. We need to be very careful that we don't get the reputation that we're like a bulldozer coming through and wiping out everything on the path that we're on. We need to spiritually rethink that, if we're doing that, to the mentality of, I've got to figure out a way I can talk to that person out of love to help guide them to where they need to be. Not to, I'm going to show you I'm right and blow them out of their shoes, but to lead them in a certain way. Y'all have any thoughts you want to share? Because if you don't, we're finished. Thank you all for being here tonight. Wow, right on time. Thank you all for being here.